Chapter 7. On Extinction. The claim that evolution is a fact often rests on the assumption that evolution means change over time. As no one doubts that change over time is a reality, it's an easy case to make. But by evolution, we understand something much more precise than that. Extinction, on the other hand, is a fact any way you look at it. Dinosaurs make the case quite effectively. So what does extinction tell us about evolution and about our own times? By one estimate, 99.9% of all species that ever lived are now extinct. If so, we might reasonably assume that, just as we all are destined to die, so all species are destined to go extinct. The most famous modern example is that of the passenger pigeon. Martha, the last living specimen, died at the Cincinnati Zoo in 1914. The last known Tasmanian wolf died in the Hobart Zoo in 1936. There are said to have been 5 mass extinctions, very roughly at 100 million year intervals. The 5th is thought to have been caused by a meteorite about 65 million years ago, killing off the dinosaurs. But no one is sure where it landed or whether it really caused their extinction. A large underwater crater in the Yucatan is the current favorite. Others now suggest that climate change may have been the villain. There have also been numerous background extinctions, which seem to be continuous. Some say that background and mass extinctions blend into one another. Many paleontologists and commentators think that we are now experiencing the 6th and worst mass extinction, the one caused by human beings. Anyone searching the subject online today will find that extinction of the old-fashioned kind has almost been submerged by the supposedly high current rate of extinction, a rate attributed to human carelessness and indifference. Leading the list of indictments has been the destruction of habitat, the loss of biodiversity, and global warming. I shall have something to say about these issues, best thought of as political, later in this chapter. Meanwhile, what caused all those earlier extinctions, whether mass or background? Darwin discussed the issue at some length in The Origin of Species. Extinction, he argued, is intimately connected with natural selection, his all-explanatory mechanism. Selection preserved favored forms, a truism, which duly survived. But he further claimed that most geographical areas are already fully stocked with inhabitants, from which it followed that as the favored forms increase in number, so generally will the less favored decrease and become rare. Rarity, as geology tells us, is the precursor to extinction. Darwin conceded, correctly, that we don't have any way of knowing that any given region really is fully stocked with species. But that also meant there was no way of testing his theory. Later, he repeated his extinction argument in a slightly different form. Each new form will tend in a fully stocked country to take the place of and finally to exterminate its own less improved parent or other less favored forms with which it comes into competition. Thus, extinction and natural selection will, as we have seen, go hand in hand. The alternative was to believe that the number of specific forms goes on perpetually and almost indefinitely increasing. But he believed that no such increase had been observed, as geology shows us plainly. Indeed, he added, we can see why the number of species should not have increased, for the number of places in the polity of nature is not indefinitely great. Darwin's argument can be analogized to a building with a flat roof and no side barriers. As new people, better adapted ones, keep coming up an escalator into the limited space on top, others, already on the roof and less well adapted, get pushed off and fall to their deaths. Such is the philosophy of progress that animated Darwin and his contemporaries. Well-adapted organisms kept on replacing less well-adapted ones. The fit are replaced by the fitter, and the fittest inevitably survive. And so life keeps right on improving. It hardly needs saying that such a philosophy has been overthrown in our own day. In the Western world, humans are widely seen as the villains of creation, an ongoing threat to many other life forms. It follows for the idea's proponents that our numbers should, ideally, be reduced or at least minimized. Alan Weisman's book, The World Without Us, in which humans have disappeared without explanation, became a surprise bestseller in 2007. Weisman called his book a fantasy, but it was widely seen as an optimistic one. Darwin resumed his discussion of extinction later on in The Origin. This time he compared the philosophies of uniformitarianism and catastrophism. The biblical flood was the primeval catastrophe, but by Darwin's day it was already seen as a myth. Enlightenment ideas were fast replacing biblical ones. The old notion was that the Earth's inhabitants had been swept away by catastrophes, Darwin wrote, but that view was being abandoned even by those geologists, and here he named 3, whose general views would naturally lead them to this conclusion. Darwin thought the study of tertiary formations gave us good reason to accept a more uniformitarian philosophy, in which species gradually disappeared, one after another, first from one spot, then from another, and finally from the world. Tertiary refers to the geologic period from 66 million to about 2.5 million years ago. Throughout the 19th century, the philosophy of gradualism replaced catastrophism, with Darwin's The Origin greatly contributing to the New World view. Oddly enough, physical evidence for past global catastrophes has accumulated in recent years, leading to a revival of interest in catastrophism. In the uniformitarian or gradualist view, supported by the geologist Charles Lyell and then by Darwin, physical causes acting now are assumed to be the same as those that acted in the past. Therefore, the present is a reliable guide to the past. Modern science itself was partly an offspring of the uniformitarian worldview. Predictions, for example, can only really be tested in an environment that is roughly unchanging, and so predictable. Catastrophism, in contrast, introduces unforeseen events. Abrupt novelties, such as meteorites plunging into the Earth and maybe wiping out the dinosaurs, could happen at any time. In the modern polity of nations, to use Darwin's phrase, revolutions are often admired, at least by those on the political left. To them, parliaments are old-fashioned affairs, and the rule of law, with its slow, incremental changes, is a little on the dull side, perhaps too predictable. Stephen Jay Gould, who was partly responsible for the renewed popularity of catastrophism, wrote in his introduction to David M. Raup's book, Extinction, Bad Genes or Bad Luck, 1991. The extraterrestrial theory of mass extinction, easy to conceptualize but purposed with good supporting data for the first time only in 1980, may revolutionize not only our view of life's history, but our entire concept of historical change by making a legitimate catastrophism respectable again. So again, what caused all those earlier extinctions? In Darwin Retried, my old friend Norman Macbeth quoted Gavin de Beer as saying that it remains unclear why any given species has disappeared. De Beer was director of London's Natural History Museum and president of the Linnean Society in the 1950s. Macbeth also saw that extinction's difficulty parallels the one besetting natural selection. It is all too easy to say that a species becomes extinct because it failed to adapt, while establishing its failure to adapt only by its becoming extinct. The Harvard evolutionist Ernst Mayr did say something close to that. In 1963, he claimed that extinction was due to the inability of animals to respond to new selection pressures. Then he added, the actual cause of the extinction of any fossil species will presumably always remain uncertain. George Gaylord Simpson said much the same thing. Particular cases of extinction other than those evidently due to competition are usually hard or impossible to explain in detail. The basic problem was that there are too many possibilities to choose from, just as there often are with establishing the cause of an individual death in the absence of a pathologist. In 2013, Charles Marshall of UC Berkeley's Museum of Paleontology offered the failure to evolve in relation to the environment as a cause of extinction. A decrease in the origin of new species seemed to be driving some mammals to extinction, he thought. Notice that Darwin saw an increase in speciation as a driver of extinction. For Charles Marshall, a decline has the same effect. Raupp's Caveats. Perhaps the most open-minded book on the subject today is the late David M. Raupp's 1991 work, Extinction, Bad Genes or Bad Luck. A paleontologist at the University of Chicago and a member of the National Academy of Sciences, he also wrote The Nemesis Affair, The Story of the Death of Dinosaurs and the Waves of Science, 1986. His extinction book includes the following passage, echoing De Beer, Mayer, and Simpson. The disturbing reality is that for none of the thousands of well-documented extinctions in the geologic past do we have a solid explanation of why the extinction occurred. We have many proposals in specific cases, of course. Trilobites died out because of competition from newly evolved fish. Dinosaurs were too big or stupid. The antlers of Irish elk became too cumbersome. They are all plausible scenarios, but no matter how plausible, they cannot be shown to be true beyond reasonable doubt. Equally plausible alternative scenarios can be invented with ease, and none has predictive power in the sense that it can be shown a priori that a given species or anatomical type was destined to go extinct. Sadly, the only evidence for the inferiority of victims of extinction is the fact of their extinction, a circular argument. The weakness of the argument does not, of course, invalidate the notion that extinction is based on fitness. It may only reflect our ignorance. For example, mammals of the late Cretaceous may have actually been better adapted than the dinosaurs, but our knowledge of these animals may not be good enough for us to recognize that superiority. Raupp's comment about extinctions is a mirror image of Darwin's about speciation. Just as in no case do we have a solid explanation of why the extinction occurred, so in no case does Darwin give us a solid explanation of why speciation occurred. David Raupp, 1933 to 2015, was refreshingly non-dogmatic, frequently offering alternative ways of looking at the evidence. Extinction is a difficult research topic, he allowed. He thought that there might be 40 million species alive today and that 1,000 times that number were extinct. Species are temporary phenomena. An average duration of 10 million years for a particular species is unusually long. Yet even that is only a small fraction, 0.25%, of the duration of life on Earth. His outlook is sometimes Darwinian, as when he accepts that some disappearances are what he calls pseudo-extinctions. One species may disappear by transforming itself into another. Yet he also accepts that true extinction is real and prevalent. But he also challenged Darwin as when he questioned the importance of competition. For Darwin, whose master was Malthus, competition was the beating heart of natural selection. Raupp allowed that evolutionary biologists have long emphasized competition, but more recently, ecologists have downplayed its role. Competition, Raupp thought, may not be as crucial as once thought, especially in extinction. In Darwin's view, it was the force of competition that kept driving new productions onward and upward in a progressive direction. We have heard of living fossils, such as sharks, horseshoe crabs, the ginkgo tree, and the coelacanth, which seems to have endured forever. But in none of those cases is the living species the same as the fossil species. In detail, the Jurassic types of shark and horseshoe crabs are not to be confused with those living today. Raupp also discussed the amazing flying reptiles known as pterosaurs, which lived from about 200 million years ago to the Cretaceous Tertiary extinction, the one thought to have been caused by a meteorite. One of the pterosaurs was larger than many airplanes. Its wings had no feathers, but were formed of large folds or extensions of skin suspended from greatly lengthened bones of fingers. somewhat like the wings of modern bats. Furthermore, pterosaurs were capable of taking off from level ground and of powered flight, yet they left no descendants. Faced with such marvels, an agnostic Raup seemed to be saying, "Who knows how all these things happened?" Pterosaurs were merely another successful group that appeared, flourished for a time, then disappeared. Lest I give the impression of the pterosaur interval as being short-lived, note that their time on Earth was 30 times longer than ours so far. Like Darwin, Raup believed that extinction encouraged evolution. The fossil record shows that many adaptive breakthroughs, bursts of speciation, accompanied by the origin of new families and orders, occur after the big mass extinctions. Perhaps another way of looking at the matter is to suggest that the history of life on Earth is analogous to a 6-act play, with the 5 great extinctions ringing down the curtain at the close of each act. Humans appear only toward the end, in the last act. Meanwhile, bacteria seem to be an exception to the theory that extinction drives evolution. Visible in the Precambrian period, bacteria do not appear to have changed much during their long tenure on Earth, Raup said. They are difficult to kill, and many of the earliest bacteria are indistinguishable in shape and structure from their living counterparts. As a side note, Karl Popper called bacteria immortal. When a bacterium divides, where is the individual that preceded the division? If one of those new bacteria dies, is that any different from the death of a skin cell? In other words, the entire population of a bacterial species may be compared to a single individual. Raup was a strong supporter of the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. Only by discovering life elsewhere in space will we really have the means to know whether our own biological system has predictable patterns not yet recognized. No extraterrestrial life has yet been found, of course. He noted that sea level, whether high or low, may have been associated with extinction, and that the level at present is somewhat lower than it was during most times in the past. Raup was not among today's climate change alarmists. While temperature fluctuations are large, he wrote, the overall trend as the present day is approached is one of cooling. That was written in 1990, so maybe the Earth has warmed up a little since then. The 6th Great Extinction. The leading proponents of the claim that humans are causing the 6th Great Extinction have been former Vice President Al Gore and Harvard Emeritus Professor E.O. Wilson. In 2014, Wilson visited England for a symbolic groundbreaking of the Mass Extinction Memorial Observatory to be built in Dorset, the country where we found an abundance of those speckled moths. On this occasion, in a BBC interview, Wilson dismissed Richard Dawkins as a mere journalist. The Memorial Observatory is on the World Heritage Jurassic Coast. Why had not one heard of that? And it will highlight 17,000 species under threat worldwide. It will also function as an information and exhibition center dedicated to the 860 species of animals, birds, insects, and sea life that have been identified as extinct since the demise of the dodo in the 17th century. Notice the big disparity between the number of threatened and identified extinctions, the former 20 times greater than the latter. If there have been 860 known extinctions since the time of dodo, approximately 1650 AD, that would be close to 2 species a year possibly attributable to human action. Is that figure shockingly large? Estimates of the number of species alive today range from 8.7 million to 1 trillion. It is generally thought that perhaps as much as 99% of the species that ever lived are now extinct. Even at the low end of the current inventory, that would mean that nature has done away with far more species than the human race has. Denise O'Leary, the editor of a website called Uncommon Descent, considers that a real possibility. But it all depends on your point of view. She gave the example of the black bear, which has been doing well in the Canadian province of Ontario. Bears can live off stuff humans throw out, so can raccoons, skunks, etc. Deer like horticultural gardens just fine. Many people feed wild birds, squirrels, chipmunks, rabbits. In Toronto, where I lived for nearly 50 years, thousands of Canada geese no longer migrate as people feed them, and they can gobble lawns in milder winter weather. Agriculture has not hurt the woodchuck or the grasshopper one bit. Human prosperity has not hurt wildlife here, if you go by the hugely increased premium food supply humans create. But that's just me. Maybe if I lived in the rainforest, I would see something different. In an interview at Harvard, Wilson recently gave a more global account, showing the high degree of uncertainty. We are on a little-known planet. We have knowledge of 2 million species, but for the vast majority we know only the name and a little bit of the anatomy. We don't know anything at all about their biology. There are conservatively at least 8 million species in all. And it's probably much more than that because of the bacteria and archaea and microorganisms we're just beginning to explore. The number of species remaining to be discovered could easily go into the tens of millions. Well, is it 8 million or tens of millions? No matter. The great drive to indict the human race seems unstoppable, reflecting the huge loss of self-confidence that overcame Western elites in the latter part of the 20th century. It is a development that would have amazed Darwin himself. A Washington Post review of Wilson's latest book, The Meaning of Human Existence, was headlined, "Is Earth's Dominant Species Doomed to Self-Destruct?" In recent years, exaggerated concern about human activity has become the norm. In 1980, the Global 2000 report predicted that 15 to 20% of all species would become extinct by the year 2000. In 1993, Aaron Wildavsky and Julian Simon concluded that those numbers were based on pure guesswork. More recently, Wilson updated that, saying it is entirely possible that we will lose half the world's species by the end of the 21st century. A British newspaper reported that for the first time since the dinosaurs disappeared, humans are driving animals and plants to extinction faster than new species can evolve. One might add that no subject is more susceptible to influence by fashionable opinion than claims about extinction. The crisis is driven by hunting, the spread of alien predators, and disease and climate change, according to the newspaper report. The Center for Biological Diversity said in 2010 that although extinction is a natural phenomenon occurring at a background rate of about 1 to 5 species per year, scientists estimate we're now losing species at 1,000 to 10,000 times the background rate, with literally dozens going extinct every day. The center added that as many as 30 to 50% of all species could be heading for extinction by mid-century. Maybe in the end, we shouldn't take either these extinction numbers or their explanation too seriously. Natural selection is enlisted to explain either the origin of a species or its extinction. Did the organism flourish? That's natural selection for you. Did it die out? That's the failure of natural selection. First it got the job done, but then it put the organism in a fix with no solution. We should be every bit as skeptical about extinction rates as of claims about natural selection.